how do you see key players like Andrew Tate filling that gap? Do you feel like he's maybe more of a symptom of the society that we're living in, or do you think he's a cause of the problems that we're facing with something like a crisis of masculinity?
It's a really good question. I feel like Andrew Tate has probably been a blessing for a lot of people, calling a spade culturally. And I feel like he's also definitely a product of just what we've created. But I do think that he's kind of filled this void post cancel culture. That was, I don't know if you remember cancel culture.
I do ish. Just like, because of like my favorite YouTubers being cancelled from it.
But like, dude, he wouldn't have been, there's no way that he would have been around. But there's been this sort of period, I think, like this last like 5 years where masculinity has now started to be re-embraced. There's less talk around toxic masculinity. I still think it's, and maybe this is me just being in my own echo chamber here in Austin, but I do think people are now seeing that, you know, masculine and feminine dynamics are really important. We should understand both of them. And like, yeah, I don't necessarily think everything that Andrew Tate has to say is all good or all bad. I do think he's just a product of the system. I think that for the most part, he's done a lot of good in terms of waking people up, and kind of the jarring content that he puts out there. Definitely, I think it's probably fathered more guys who are lost than it has turned people away, if I had to guess. You know, teaching people about, you know, how to be confident, how to step into masculine traits. I don't think he's right about a lot of things, but and I also don't follow his content a ton, so I'm definitely not speaking from an area of like knowing everything that he does and says. I also think like his business doings, from what I've heard of, it's like, you know, started out doing cam girl stuff. It's like, all right, and then he's going to talk about religion and the need for religion. Like, you know, those two things don't really go hand in hand. So on one hand, I feel like he's done a great job, like putting life back into the conversation around the need for religion and belief in a higher power. But I also think that some of the stuff he does and says is a little bit bombastic.
Bombastic's a good word. I highly disagree with him as an individual.
As a person?
I think, yeah, he's a pretty highness individual, if that's the right word to use.
Like thinks really highly of himself?
No, as in like heinous, I
heinous.
think is the word. Heinous, yeah. Different pronunciations.
Yeah.
But, I question his integrity a lot. And, you know, he makes all this content speaking about empowering men.
Yeah.
But then he goes on the Full Send podcast and laughs about how he scammed men out of their money and their life savings and ruined their marriages to start his cam business.
Yeah, see, that's nasty.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance with him, and potentially, you know, I saw him as a comedian when I first saw his videos, and it's just...
Was he actually marketing himself as a comedian?
No, not at all.
Oh, you're saying
but
like...
I saw him as a comedian, and then it would have been funny. It would have been like, look at this guy who's this macho figure that's every single stereotype of what a man should be in today's world, but can't be. But when it becomes a problem is when people take it seriously, and it's weird how the internet does that. I've seen that with a few things where people take things so literally.
Yeah.
And I don't really quite understand why that is.
Yeah, the internet, it's so easy to just, it's like, pulling a verse from the Bible that makes, like, fully out of context, makes no sense, you know, and then you say it and let it kind of fit your needs. Like, I feel like people will hear things online and just like, be like, oh, you know, I get what he's talking about, but ultimately, no context, you really don't understand the nature of it. Yeah,
and I haven't grown up in a conservative background at all, and I don't identify myself as a conservative, whatever the fuck that's worth.
Yeah.
But I definitely see value to sticking to certain traditions and falling back on infrastructure that's been in place for hundreds and thousands of years for a reason. Whereas I've been toying with this idea recently in my head that the internet, when it first started, it was like, look at this new thing. We obviously can't trust it because it's so underdeveloped. So no one would go to the internet for their revision, for exams or whatever else. They would use books. And then you see this great evolution where suddenly everyone trusts the internet, especially just speaking anecdotally from my friends. if you want the answer to a question that you're talking about in a conversation, what do? You Google it and you take the first answer.
Right.
Now you take the first answer from ChatGPT, which is a whole other conversation. But the way I see the direction of travel is that we're going to get to a point where, and this is in the next few years, the internet's so developed that it sort of horseshoes back to you can't trust anything, because not that it's underdeveloped, but because there's so much development, you can easily fake a 100 branch citation for a study that never happened.
I think you're already seeing it. Yeah. I think you're spot on. The more imposters and fake accounts and bot accounts that can pop up, and it just becomes just a sea of like, well, there's probably some people on here who are genuine, but it seems like it's just a lot of fake stuff. So I'm just not even going to really like fully pay attention to it. But I feel like it's so engaging and designed to be just like consumed that people will be hooked, you know? In a lot of ways, like, yeah, people will still fall for it. So like there will still be life online. I just don't think it'll be one where like you'll see a whole lot of people who are healthy mentally and physically, because I think the trust factor online is just so hard to actually maintain.
And maybe this is my naive opinion, not sort of looking at the consequences further down the line, but I think there should totally be pretty extreme consequences legally if you're online pitching these ideas that World War III is about to start as soon as something else pops off in the Middle East or wherever. You see it all the time, is this World War III? ? And it's all this culture porn that stokes fear. And I think it's genuinely harmful for society, because it used to be that social media and the internet was detached from our everyday lives, but now they are our everyday lives.
Yeah, totally. Could you imagine just living off grid, being in the middle of nowhere, having no semblance of any idea of like what's happening in any other corner of the world? Like the speed that you would operate at is so different than what we see online. Every day we're seeing World War III. It's like they're just, whether anyone knows it or not, it's just programming that into our subconscious that, we need to be in more of a heightened state of fear. We need to be careful. Things are not okay right now. The culture is not healthy. We're always in contention with other people. That's terrible for our subconscious.
Yeah, it's like one big placebo that's eventually going to convince you that it actually works.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, whether it's someone consciously doing it or not consciously doing it, that in a lot of ways is like mind control. It's just keep pumping out this message that, these things are happening, war all the time. And eventually I feel like people have gotten numb to the idea of war. Like I'll see a video on my feed and I'm like, oh, it's, looks like Call of Duty, and I say that and it's like, it's sad how numb we've come to a lot of that stuff.
I always have these dreams of me actually, and dreams as in fucking nightmares of me being thrown into a war zone, and suddenly it hits you in the face of how real it is. Because I think so many of us now, if we got sent over to war, we would take it lightly and we'd think that it was Call of Duty or Twitter and there's no ramifications, and suddenly you get...
And then you'd see something crazy happen and it would be like, oh man.
And I think that's what the internet's done to us. I've spoken about this before on the pod, and it's that detachment from morality, and maybe you can ground this back to religion, but when you lose the religion and you're detached from the consequences of your actions, it's much easier to be immoral. And I like to use the example of, if there were, my friends always take the piss out of me for saying this because they think it's just such a horrible, crude example. But like, if there was a little Asian child in the room with you now, sewing that t-shirt for you.
Oh yeah, you would never wear it.
You would never wear it. But
yeah,
we're both sat here in Converses and Reeboks or whatever.
Yeah.
You know how those were made, and I do.
Yeah. We obfuscate reality like so easily. It's so easy to just put things out of mind. And yeah, the internet just does an amazing job of detaching us from what's actually happening. When you see videos of like cobalt mines in Africa for all these electric cars, and then on the other side of the spectrum, you just hear people talking about electric cars saving people. Like it's like the future. This is like what's going to save us from climate change. And then you're like, well, hold on. We literally have people diving into this cobalt mine, probably harming their health being in there. And they're just, it's in the middle of nowhere, Africa. And yeah, those videos are terrifying. And then we live in this reality where, you can't have electric vehicles without that cobalt. So yeah, I think the internet can be used as a tool for good, but you need to be so mindful about how you're using it. And I think that does shift when you start to become more of a creator and less of a consumer online, putting more stuff out there. You can then start to see the internet for what it can be, but it can absolutely be a tool for good. But I think like right now we're going through a phase where it's more harmful than good for a lot of people.